Great, so our agenda today is who is TalentMap, the what and why of employee engagement, manager best practices for employee engagement, including transformational leadership, systematic way to give feedback, learn and develop, including weekly one-on-ones, state interviews, and job crafting, and then we'll have a wrap-up and time to answer questions then. So I'm Kelly Rigoli, and I'd like to introduce Sean Fitzpatrick to join us today to talk about these great topics. Over to you, Sean.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you very much for the quick introduction. And what I hope to cover off today is just 1 or 2 minutes on TalentMap. I think it's always important to understand who's presenting the content here and where it's coming from. I think that helps put it into context. It helps the audience and the group on the phone understand it. So I think that's important. Second thing, I'm just going to briefly touch on employee engagement, particularly in nonprofits. It's a little bit different that we see in nonprofits than we see in other private organizations or government organizations. So I think it's important to sort of just be aware of engagement and how it can be measured and looked at in nonprofits. The majority of what I'm going to cover off over the next 45 minutes or so is really around manager best practices for employee engagement in nonprofits. And I'm going to touch on three or 4 areas. One is I'm going to talk a little bit from a management point of view, so the transformational leadership concept. Talk a little bit of what that is, where it comes from, and why it's really important with respect to employee engagement. And then I'm also going to turn and look at some very tactical tools that we find managers use effectively in nonprofits and in profit-seeking organizations. So they're transferable tools, but they're particularly effective in nonprofits for a couple of reasons that I'll point out. So that's what I'm going to cover off, and then we'll have a bit of wrap up, as Kelly mentioned. And I guess one of the important things and why we look at employee engagement in nonprofits is because of what we're transitioning to in an economy, both in North America, Canada, the U.S., as well as in Europe, and increasingly over in Asia. And what we're noticing is the increasing importance of talent management and human capital. It's become a factor that starts to differentiate organizations, and it's becoming a factor that has been increasingly catching the attention of executive directors, of CEOs, of presidents, of both nonprofits and for-profit organizations. And one of the things that we've noticed is, particularly in nonprofits, board of directors are much more aware of the concept of people and talent and how that group of people affect the success and the ability for the nonprofit to achieve its mandate. So I really sort of contend that I think we've gone through a number of ages over the years, you know, the industrial age, the information age, and I really believe moving forward, yes, technology is going to be an important component of what we do, but the people are the ones that really make the difference. And that's what I think we're going to try to focus on today, and that's what TalentMap really stands for as a company, is really helping organizations measure, improve, and manage the culture that creates a great workplace. Just a quick overview of TalentMap. We've been in business for over 15 years, thousands of surveys run out. We have benchmarks by a number of key industries, and that's our focus. We don't do a whole bunch of other areas, a whole bunch of other work. We really help our clients improve employee engagement and the culture of the organization. That's what we really stand for. Very quickly, just a snapshot of some of our clients. We work with private sector as well as public sector and a large number of nonprofits. You can see in the bottom of this slide just a sampling of some of our clients, both in Canada, in the U.S., as well as over in Europe in terms of the nonprofit sector, which is a really important sector, a real critical sector that we're looking at. I want to then also just touch on a little bit sort of what we stand for as an organization. When we go and work with a client, we help them ask the right questions. That's around survey and survey design. It could be running an employee engagement survey or a 360 or entry exit. We help them then analyze the data. And that's not a small factor. That's much more beyond just looking at percent of people who said scored high on would they recommend your organization, but drilling down into predictive analysis. And then finally, most importantly, we help our clients act on the data. So that's using the results to change leadership and behavior. And that's really what we stand for and work at as an organization in the simplified format. So what differentiates us, and then this is the last sort of overview of who we are, and then I'll jump into the engagement concepts I want to cover off today. One of the things that differentiate, we focus on niche markets. We don't do surveys for everybody. There's certain industries we focus on, and nonprofits are one of our largest industries. We do a lot of work with nonprofits and work with hundreds of them over the last number of years. So we really got an understanding of them across North America, have built a great benchmark of nonprofits we've worked with, and we work to understand them and build products and services for that market. So the products and services we offer are very specific for the niche markets, which nonprofit is a very big one. We're very flexible. We don't conform to our process. We really work with your process, and we try to understand. We've been experienced. We've been at this work for over 15 years, and have lots of experience around it. So we're not new. We didn't just show up when engagement got hot. We've been focusing on this area of engagement for well over 15 years now. We know our stuff really well. And probably more importantly is we're evidence-based. Our questionnaires, our analysis, our best practices are based on good science, proven academic and empirical research. We don't just grab a bunch of questions and throw it at the wall and hope it sticks, and maybe something will resonate with managers. Our recommendations, our surveys, our best practices are all based on empirical data that has been tested and proven out from a science background. And then finally, of course, we're very affordable. We believe that both small business and mid-sized businesses, a lot of which are nonprofits, need a world-class management solution. But we also understand that some of them are more cash constrained than, let's say, a Fortune 500. But I don't think if you use technology effectively, which we do with our clients, you shouldn't have to pay the big blue chip fees that some of the large consulting firms ask for a similar type of solution. All right, so that's a little bit of background around TalentMap and who we are. And I guess what I want to touch on here for the rest of the webinar today is really around engagement and what engagement is, why it's important to nonprofits, and then practices that managers can do. I think one of the things, it's always important to look at engagement, and what we find with nonprofits with high levels of engagement, they tend to be a lot more efficient and effective. So they do their work better, quicker, and they focus on the right things. And what we find is those with high levels of engagement versus those who are low tend to be a lot more stakeholder focused, whether it's on the board, on their members, on the people that they're trying to serve, and the mission that they put the organization together for. Employees tend to be more creative in terms of trying to either fundraise or solve solutions. And what we find is people tend to be a lot more proud and inspired about the organization. There's a lot of great evidence, and I'm not going to go through it all. A lot of you are familiar with how important engagement is. But there's a couple of great links, and you'll be able to get it again from this deck. But Engaging for Success, Nailing the Evidence is a great piece of work that outlines all of the academic research that links employee engagement to better business outcomes, whether they're safety outcomes, productivity outcomes, goal outcomes, safety outcomes, and so on. So I think that's important to take a look at. Now let's turn to engagement. And I think it's always important to sort of start to define engagement before you start to talk about the practices that can improve it. If you don't have a clear definition, it's certainly hard to have a practice in place to improve something if you don't know what you're trying to improve. And what we contend is satisfaction is not the same as engagement. A lot of people are familiar with job satisfaction surveys or have participated in them or sort of view engagement as synonymous with job satisfaction, but it really isn't. Job satisfaction is an important concept, and it's an important concept within organizations. You want to have satisfied employees, but satisfied employees tend to be ones that are really satisfied with their situation. They're pleasant, they're gratified with everything, they're satiated, and they really focus on what's in it for me as an employee. What do I get out of the deal? Engaged employees, on the other hand, are in a very different position. They show a pile of focus, a pile of energy, enthusiasm towards their work and towards the organization. They're persistent, more adaptable. They really focus on their willingness to give back to the organization. So there's a stark difference between the two. Satisfied employees are really looking at, what do I get out of this employment deal? Engaged employees are looking at, what am I willing to give back to the organization? And that's an important differentiator, because you measure things different when you're trying to measure things that way. Here's a more formal definition of engagement. Again, I'm not going to read it all through, but I do want to point out, when you talk about engagement, it's a couple of things. It's positive, so highly engaged employee tend to be positive. It's an energized state of mind, so it's not a passive state of mind like satisfaction. It's a measure of the level of energy an employee could have towards their job or the organization. And it's rooted or stemmed in two important things: how people think about their job or their work, and how emotionally invested they are in their job and their work. And it's really a level then of personal energy people are willing to bring back towards those two components. We use a model at TalentMap called Head, Heart, and Hands, and the idea is basically, do I connect logically to my work and my career and financial goals here? And more importantly, do I connect emotionally? Do my values align with the values of my peers, the manager I work with, the leadership overall? And if you connect those two pieces together, and that's what we do when we measure engagement on our 6 core engagement questions, we're able to measure the level of discretionary effort your employees have. And I think if anyone were to remember what is engagement, probably the best 2 words to remember, it's a measure of discretionary effort, where the lowest level of discretionary effort or engagement is where someone does just enough to get by. They don't stand out, they don't do anything extra, but they don't do anything to get them fired. So that's sort of the lowest level of engagement or discretionary effort. To high levels of engagement is when they're firing on all cylinders. They're going the extra mile, they're an ambassador, they help with change, they solve problems, they go the extra mile for the customer. So very, very different approach in terms of satisfaction and engagement. Overall, what we've seen is, as I mentioned earlier, engagement helps organizations, in particular nonprofits, achieve their vision and their strategy mandate. So it certainly helps them get a lot closer than if you had average or low levels of engagement. It helps you achieve higher levels of member satisfaction, board satisfaction in terms of, and often boards are quite an important part of nonprofits, higher levels of productivity and retention with employees, and higher donor funding we're seeing within highly engaged employees. So there's a lot of business reasons why engagement is important to organizations. So that's a little bit about the why and the what of engagement. I'm going to sort of dive a little bit deeper and touch on sort of types of employee engagement or types of engagement that we see, and particularly how it affects nonprofits. There's sort of 2 types. Often you hear the concept, oh, we've got 70% level of engagement or 30% level of engagement or whatever. But I think it's important to break that concept of employee engagement down even further. And what we do with our clients, we break it down, particularly for nonprofits, into what we call job or task engagement and organizational engagement. So you could be very engaged in number 1, job or task engagement, and not all that engaged in number 2, or vice versa. You could be very engaged in the organization, not so engaged in your job. And of course, the best organizations are the ones that are able to pull people together that are both engaged in their job or task and engaged in the organization. So these 2 components can be measured well. I'll give you a really good example. We work with a lot of healthcare, social services, nonprofits, and in those types of situations, for example, when we survey medical staff or doctors in those environments versus admin staff or support staff, what we find in these social service types of organizations, healthcare type of organizations, doctors tend to have a very high level of employee or job engagement or task engagement. They really like the work, they really like what they're doing, they like working with their patients and their clients. However, their level of organizational engagement is not near as high. They don't feel as tied to the organization that they're working with, often because they're much more tied to their profession as a physician than they are to the actual what the organization stands for. On the other hand, in a lot of mission-based nonprofits, let's say it's something working towards Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Arthritis Society, or these types of organizations, what we've noticed is in those types of organizations, people go to work because of what the organization stands for. It's working at a larger mission to solve a larger social good, and people often go there because they have a tie. They either have had an issue with a particular health reason or incident, or they've had a close family member that have maybe gone through some challenges. So they're there, and they have high levels of organizational engagement, but not necessarily high levels of task engagement or job engagement, depending on the job that they're doing. So we do notice some real differences between job engagement and task engagement in different types of nonprofits, and it really depends on what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. And as I mentioned, organizations that really do both of them well, task and org engagement, seem to have the best business performance overall. I want to point out, and this is going to be available on our website, one of the things that most managers do is they underestimate the impact on employee engagement, both in terms of making a great workplace, but also in terms of the business outcomes. They think that the job or the task is vitally more important than creating an environment for employees to succeed. There's a really good paper called Engaging the Nonprofit Workplace, Mission Management and Emotion. It's on our website, and you can also Google it and find it. But what I thought was interesting in this study is that what they identified is managers often find, and leaders in nonprofits, HR or people management as one of the most depleting parts of their job. So they often go into this field because of maybe a greater mission or another reason, not because they're professional managers and they end up in a management role, but they're not necessarily well equipped to really work effectively with the people side of the business. And that's why they find it so depleting. They find it stressful, high levels of anxiety. So it's an area that we see a lot of organizations and nonprofits have underinvested in and undermanaged, is that leadership development and providing the tools for managers within these types of organizations. So let me just sort of jump ahead a little bit to helping you to connect the dots for the executive. So I always think it's important to sort of go, well, how do you connect all of this stuff together? Because you're talking about things like leadership or professional growth when you talk about engagement, and you talk about things like discretionary effort, and you talk about board and members and clients, maybe depending on how you define your nonprofit and vision and so on. And this is the way we connect the dots for the clients that we work with. On the right-hand side, what you'll see here are whatever the business objectives. In this case, I put vision mandate, whatever they're trying to achieve from a vision point of view, because nonprofits, of course, are not necessarily profit-maximizing organizations. And they might also, if they're a cause-driven organization like that looks after a group of people and they have advocacy within government, they might be trying to achieve certain advocacy goals. Regardless, it's important to understand what the business goals are. And then how do we achieve that business goals is you go back to the key stakeholders. They might be members, but they could be other stakeholders. And to achieve that stakeholder satisfaction or member satisfaction, we have to have a certain level of member value. What does the member get out of it? If it's a cause-driven organization, it might be a little bit different than, for example, a member-driven nonprofit like the Association of Engineers or something like that. So there's different types of nonprofits, and the model might look slightly different. Well, we know that to drive member value, you got to have high productivity, discretionary effort, and hopefully employees stay long enough that they get effective and good on the job. And if organizations that do that tend to have very high levels of employee engagement. So employee engagement drives productivity, discretionary effort, and retention. And we also know, and this is sort of touches on what I just talked about earlier, it's job and task engagement and organizational engagement combined is what makes up employee engagement. So you could have high levels of task engagement, low levels of organizational engagement, and you have so-so or average employee engagement. Conversely, you could have high org engagement, low task engagement, and average employee engagement. So it's important to start to look at not just engagement, but the fact that you can actually break engagement down into different components. What we do when we work with our clients is we measure not only just task and job engagement and organizational engagement to get an overall employee engagement, but we measure the factors that drive engagement, things like professional growth, teamwork, stakeholder focus, vision, leadership. All of those components are what we measure whenever we work with an organization. And through that diagnostic or survey, we're able to give levels of scores on job or task engagement, org engagement, employee engagement, which then organizations can start to work on to improve aspects that relate to their member value and their business and their goal attainment. So that's at a very high level what we try to achieve within the organizations. So now let's turn to some of the best practices we've seen with nonprofits. So now that I give a bit of context about what engagement is and how you sort of think about linking engagement throughout the organization, I want to touch on four, if time permitting, four practices that we see used effectively within nonprofits. First one's around leadership, and I'm going to touch on that. Leadership's a very big topic, and it's certainly the scope of this webinar is not designed to cover all of the leadership aspects, but I just want to introduce you to some leadership concepts. I'm going to touch on one-on-ones, show you a couple of slides on that and some of the best practices around there and why they're so important. I'm going to touch on stay interviews and what they are, how we define them, and how they're set up. And then finally, I'm going to touch on job crafting. Each one of these relate to one of the concepts in this pyramid that you'll see on the bottom left-hand side. So for example, whenever we work with nonprofits, often professional growth comes up as one of the key drivers of engagement. So the question managers often, well, how do I improve professional growth? Well, you just don't provide, here's some money, go take a course. You have to take steps to do that, and things like how you approach learning and growth, which is the transformational leadership, how you help people focus on professional development through one-on-ones, how you start to think differently about their professional growth through stay interviews, and how they can actually recraft their work and their job through job crafting, for example, touches on just one of those key drivers of the 12 core, which is professional growth. So I'm going to try to loop those together in a few minutes. Let's just turn to leadership styles. There's a whole range of different leadership styles out there. People are very familiar with these styles, or some of them are. You might be familiar with some of these styles, maybe not all of them. But and these are studied in the science and academic world. There's authoritarian leadership style, very autocratic. A recent Cuban Fidel Castro just passed. He would have probably fallen into that authoritarian rule in terms of his leadership style and what he did with Cuba. So that that's one style of leadership. There's participative or democratic. That's where you try to get everyone involved in making the decision. No one's really has a real strong voice, but as a group you have a voice. There's delegative, which sometimes can get into this concept of laissez-faire type of leadership, where you have a leader that's in charge but really doesn't make any decisions, doesn't really push anything, maybe almost abdicates his responsibility as a leader in some way. So it's called the laissez-faire, just whatever happens, happens. There's things like situational leadership. Some of you may have heard it, depending on the situation. If you have a new employee that has very little skills, you might have a much more directive style versus if you have a very highly experienced employee that knows their job really well, you might have a much more delegative style of leadership. Servant leadership, transactional leadership. Often you see this in military. Do this, don't ask why, and just do it. So it's very much a transactional style of leadership. And then there's transformational style, and I'm going to touch on transformational. Of all the leadership styles that have been linked and measured relative to employee engagement, it's the transformational leadership style that has shown to be the most impactful on improving employee engagement. So that's why I'm focusing on these. There's no one right leadership style. They can change depending on the environment and depending on the type of business. But in particular, in nonprofits and in nonprofits driving engagement, it's transformational leadership which is the most important. So I thought, oh, I didn't know I had such good graphics today. I thought I should just touch on just an introduction to transformational leadership and where it came from. And some of you may have heard about it before, and some may have heard about some of these writers or authors or academics. But basically, it's a concept that came into sort of being back in the academic world back in the 70s, and then James McGregor got sort of popularized it in his book called Leadership, 1978. He's an academic. Bass is another academic that really pushed it even further along and started to develop models and factors of behavior, so actually quantifying what a transformative leadership behaviors that they'll do. And Noel Tichy and Devana also published a book called The Transformational Leadership in the late 80s. So it's been around for a while, but it's not really thought about in a real consistent way with all of the managers out there, and I think it's something that should be taught and trained more in nonprofits. This is the whole definition from Bass and Riegel in 2006. Transformational leadership stimulate and inspire their followings to achieve extraordinary outcomes. In the process, develop their followers on leadership capacity. I won't read the whole thing, but you can start to get a sense of what transformational leaders are and how they start to be different. And again, this is not a whole course on transformational leadership, but I thought it would be important to introduce the concepts for those who are not familiar with, and it's something that organizations should start to pay more attention to, particularly nonprofits, because it drives and is shown to be empirically linked to engagement. The leader's goal of a transformational leadership is to inspire followers to share that leader's values. So this is why values are important. You hear more talk about them, I find, lately. And connect with the leader's vision. So it's really to inspire people to share and connect with that leader's values and visions. And some of the key assumptions of transformational leadership is that people will willingly follow a leader who inspires them. And that's probably common sense, but that's sort of what really a core assumption is. Another core assumption is this is really important. The vision and passion of one man or one person can transform his followers, and together they can achieve great things. And I think if you looked over the history of corporate data, Steve Jobs comes to mind when you think of how he transformed Apple into something that produces, what some would consider just fabulous products. It comes to mind, I recently upgraded my Apple phone lately, so it came to mind on that. And then they also provide energy and enthusiasm, which are tonics that get things done. So this is sort of some of the underlying assumptions that these transformational leaders bring, and I think that's important. The other key around transformational leadership, which makes it different from transactional leadership or democratic leadership and some of the other leadership styles, is that it's a process that changes and transforms both the followers and the leader themselves. So it's a concept where the leader comes in knowing that he or she may not be the greatest leader or have all the skills, but they work together with the leader and the followers to change and transform both the followers' expectations, goals, and aspirations, as well as the leader's goals and aspirations. And it's very connected to concepts of emotions, values, standards, ethics, and overall long-term goals. And that's why you start to see the connection back to employee engagement, which is very much based on people's emotions. It's not just logic, but it's also based on emotion. If we look at our head, heart, and hands, the heart component of our model around measuring engagement ties to the emotional side. And it's a transformation that motivates followers to accomplish more than what's usually expected. And the sum, so both the leader and the followers become more powerful than the individual parts of the team put together. So transformational leadership, and just one or two more slides, then I'll flick over to the other tools. Transformational leadership is a very powerful mindset and set of training that I think all nonprofits can benefit from, or depending on where they are in their organizational history, but the majority of nonprofits can benefit from. just to give you a sense of components of transformational leadership, one key component, there's individual consideration. So the leader looks at their workforce not as one whole, but understands the individual needs of each of his or her direct reports. No one size fits all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in 3 tools, in my one-on-one best practices, job crafting, and stay interviews, because that really touches on this important component of what transformational leadership brings, which is this individualized consideration for their employees. The other important thing is this intellectual stimulation, this idea of promoting creative and independent thinking within their followers. I'll touch on that with job crafting in particular. And then inspirational and motivational. So it's a concept of the energy that the leader brings, the charisma, inspirement, their engagement and their commitment to their work and to the task as a manager and as a leader in that role. And then finally, idealized influence. These are not my terms. These are sort of out of the academic literature, but I wanted to sort of give you a sense of the grounding in here, because this is based on the science side of things. This is around practices that ethics, instills pride and trust, and appreciates core values. So these are some of the, well, these are the 4 components of transformational leadership, and some of the key things that these individuals, transformational leaders, bring. And I'm going to touch on the best practices that link to this in terms of that. So that's a little bit about leadership and a little bit about transformational leadership, very high level. It's a very important topic that I really just scratched the surface on, and there's quite a bit more. We do 360 surveys that measure transformational leadership style, and that's one of our practices that we do, and that's given us great insight to what's working and what isn't working. However, that's only part of it. That's only what the manager can do. I think it's also important to look at the other half of the solution when you're looking at engagement. And that's starting to look at what's important to the employee, what's the onus or the responsibility of the employee in nonprofits with respect to engagement. And this is where a manager can get really effective. It's not just around creating a better leader as an individual and working on the management style or skills, but it's also helping the employee develop themselves, and that's going back to this concept of intellectual stimulation and individual consideration, that we need to have not just managers leading in an autocratic style, but we need to have people developing. And how do you go about doing that? Well, let me touch on that in the tools that I'll touch on in just a minute. I saw this study, and I thought it was very appropriate for this webinar. This is a poll of Training Magazine. So it's about 800 readers, so it's a large poll. And Training Magazine is a magazine about, it's a well-known magazine about training and the training industry and so on. But what I thought was important, it polled both senior leaders, individual leaders, and individuals. And it was questions around how people responded, how well do they feel jointly responsible for engagement at work? So the question was really, as an employee, how much do you feel you should be looking after your own engagement, and how much do you think it's responsibility of your manager, and how much is the responsibility of your leader? And you'll notice what's very interesting in here when you look at some of the sort of core components of an engaged workforce, meaningful work, autonomy, task variety, workload balance, feedback. Almost all of them, the individual felt that they are jointly responsible or even highly responsible for creating engagement at work. So meaningful work. The employee themselves, right in here, almost 50%, a little more than 50% of them thought it was their primary responsibility, followed by their immediate manager, followed by their senior leader. So they thought creating meaningful work is really the employee's primary responsibility. Creating autonomy, so having control over workload, when the work gets done, how the work gets done, and so on, sort of a joint responsibility, pretty close between the individual and the manager. Task variety, the type of work that I work on, again, these are all linked to high levels of engagement. Again, very high levels of responsibility for the individual and slightly higher than what they expect from their manager. So the task variety can influence engagement, and people think that they have a lot of control over that. And then workload balance. You hear that a lot in today's workplace about work-life balance and work-life integration. But it's interesting. in this poll, it found that employees felt that they have a lot more control over it than their manager or certainly senior leaders have. The last thing is feedback, and of course they thought, their manager's highly responsible and they have the jointly responsible for feedback, where the individual and senior leadership much less, and that makes a lot of sense. Why I wanted to point that out is because often when we look at engagement, we think that it is all the manager's responsibility or it's all the senior leadership's responsibility. But when you start to look underneath the covers a little bit, what you find is employees themselves understand that they are partly responsible for creating their own engagement. And I think that's a big part of the equation that we don't talk a lot about in engagement and best practices around engagement. So that's what I want to turn to now. I'm going to look at weekly one-on-ones, what they are briefly, how they work, and how it can help individuals enhance their own engagement. I'm going to then turn to stay interviews, what stay interviews are, and again, how that can enhance engagement, and then finally job crafting, and then we'll wrap up. So weekly one-on-ones. Some of you may do this. What we find is most organizations don't do this, or if they do it, they don't do it very well. Weekly one-on-ones are probably the most important actions performed by managers in nonprofits today. And what they are is they are short meetings, usually 30 minutes in length. They're regularly scheduled. They're never missed. So this is not something that we'll do weekly one-on-ones, but they keep on getting postponed or pushed off, or if I had my one-on-ones, I had it 3 months ago or I had it a month ago. Never missed, meaning 95% of the time it's happened every single week. It's primarily focused on the team member. So this is not focused on the manager and what the manager wants to tell, here, do this, do that, but it's mainly focused on what the team member's working on, what their challenges are, what their opportunities that they see. And then follow-up and notes are critical, and particularly getting into the rhythm of the weekly period. So these are very effective, and I can tell you in the survey research we do, we often ask about when's the last time you've actually met your manager. Even though you ask the manager this, they'll say, I'm with my direct reports weekly. You ask those same employees consistently, and what we find is employees consistently score significantly lower or less. They can claim a lot less weekly one-on-ones than actually managers claim. And because I would tend to believe the employees, they don't have a vested interest to say, I do them, where managers tend to do. So we do see it, and in practice and anecdotal when we walk into organizations and talk to people. So even though people talk about it, they don't do it systematically. And doing it systematically is probably one of the most important aspects of weekly one-on-ones, even more than what maybe they talk about. So just a little cheat sheet that we have that we share with our clients around one-on-ones, what they are. For most managers are weekly. Sometimes they could be bi-weekly, and only a few managers could be monthly, depending on your situation. But they're sacrosanct, meaning they have to happen, and good managers never miss them. And this is what we find to get this practice in place. Very simple practice, not expensive, but it takes discipline. And that discipline doesn't cost money. It costs energy and time of senior leaders to get it done. In these cheat sheets, we show you, where to conduct them, not in a public place, of course. Doesn't have to be private, but it has to be sort of low-keyed. If you do it in your office, cubicle with sensitivity, you can do it in a cubicle with some sensitivity around it. And typically they're 30 minutes. 10 minutes for them. The first 10 minutes is about what's on their mind, what do they have, what are the initiatives they're working on that they want to talk to you about. The next 10 minutes is for you as a manager. What is it that you want to focus on? What are the initiatives you want to communicate to them? What have you heard recently in a more senior level management meeting that is important to share with them individually? And the last 10 minutes is, okay, how do we help you develop your growth, your career, and as an individual? What are things you're working on that you can touch on your growth? This is not a discussion that should be happening once a year or once every 6 months, but weekly. We have a form that our clients use on that, but just to give you a sense, and again, you can copy this and use it, but the team member, the department, it's often good to have a few personal notes about the individual once you learn more about them, their spouse, their children, their hobbies, their friends, they have any pets, those types of things, and that becomes your online form that you always have in front of you when you're talking to them, so you can ask them not just about the job and the task, but ask them about personal things, and that's going back to individualized consideration that I talked about earlier with respect to transformational leadership. Then team member update, 10 minutes for them. Manager updates, usually you prepare, you have your notes, your bullets that you want to cover off, and then future, where you're going, where you're heading around development and preparing for the next one-on-one, which would be the following week. So that's a little bit about one-on-ones. I'm going to flip now over to, and what I wanted to do today is, again, not get into the how and implementation of each of these tools, but to expose you to some of these tools that are out there and approaches that are out there that are very effective to driving engagement. The next one I'm going to touch on are stay interviews. Stay interviews are a very effective tool to help with retention, to help get underneath around engagement and get deeper discussion than just the weekly one-on-ones. Stay interviews are periodic, so this is not something you do weekly, you don't do monthly, but you might do them once a year, twice a year. They're one-on-one, they're structured discussions, they're not free-form, between a manager and employee, and it identifies and reinforces the factors that drive employee retention and engagement. So it's a structured discussion focused just on those factors. What keeps you here and what engages you. Why they're so effective and why they're effective for the employee is because when you sit down and ask employees, what is it that keeps you here, makes you not want to look for another job, and what engages you, what type of work engages you, it stimulates the thinking of the employee. They start to think about their job in a different way. Rather than doing it day to day, they start to think about, why do I like this job? Why do I come to work here? Why do I like the type of work or type of organization that I'm doing? So it stimulates broader thinking for the employee, which is very effective. They build trust. That fact of sitting down once or twice a year and having this discussion can be very effective at building trust between employee and managers, which we know is important for engagement. They include action. So at the end of the stay interview, you have some bullets and you have agreed, either the employee has agreed to do some things or the manager or both. What's nice too is there's very little pressure. This is not your performance management discussion or interview. So there's a lot less pressure on the employee or the manager to make important decisions. It's not tied to your pay, or it's not tied to anything that goes on your employee file. But it is really an opportunity for manager and employee to get to know each other better from an engagement and retention focus. It's all focused on the positive for the most part, and it's really about what is it that keeps you here? What do you like about the organization? What is it that engages you? It doesn't require a lot of training for managers. A quick read and maybe a 30 or an hour workshop about stay interviews, and managers are ready to go and have these discussions. So they're very inexpensive to get up and going. And again, easy to access. We have tools that you could provide if you want them. Quickly, a structure of a stay interview at a very high level. We have a more detailed cheat sheet on this. Happy to share with you, but they're generally about an hour long. And they start with introductory questions, just warming up the conversation, a little bit of background, and so on. Now, managers that have done their weekly one-on-ones have some details about who they are and what they do. They could ask them about their kids, their hobbies, their dog, or pet, or whoever. Then you get into the meat of the interview. First of all, you want to identify factors that make employees want to stay and engage. So you want to ask about positive stay factors, reason. You might ask them, what reasons do you give to others why you stay at this organization? What do you tell your spouse why you like it here? So you get them talking about those types of things. You might ask them about best work of your life. When you're here, tell me about when you feel you're doing your best work, or the days that you're doing your best work. Those are the types of questions. There's some more on the what are days that you feel that you're fully using all of your skills or jobs or tasks. So those are helping ideas, helping employees understand why they want to stay and engage. Then what you want to do is identify positive actions related to retention that might further increase engagement. So you start to not only what keeps you here and what engages you, but what could we do better? You as an individual, or me as a manager, or us as an organization. What would you like to be better managed, or how would you like to be managed differently? What are some positive elements of the management approach and organization, and maybe less desirable? Do you have a dream job? Where would you like to be in X years? And so having those discussions around growth You know, how would you like to be recognized is a very effective way, because people get engaged when they're recognized, but you may not know what, you know, some people want public recognition, some want much low-keyed recognition. So, so those types of questions are important. And then the last part of the stay interview is to identify possible triggers that might cause the employee to consider leaving the organization. So that's really around things you could ask them about recent frustration. So in the last 2 weeks or the last 3 weeks, what has frustrated you within this organization? And they might talk about the technology. They might talk about an individual interaction. You know, they might talk about certain things that frustrate them. And those could be possible triggers. If they get out of control, it could cause the employee to leave. Others that made you think. So sometimes, you know, so-and-so left the organization. What did you think about that? Did you think about changing your role? And maybe even ask about past triggers, why you left previous organizations or jobs if they have left them. You know, these are some tools that are, or scripts that can help you around making for an effective stay interview. And the last thing I want to touch on is job crafting. And I know I got a few minutes left. I want to touch on my last tool here, which I find is really effective. I'm going to touch on what is it, why it's important to the organization, and just basically how do you start it. And again, each one of these tools need a little bit more training, but not much. And that's why I wanted to identify them, because I know that nonprofits don't have unlimited funds around management and leadership development. So first of all, job crafting. What is job crafting? Job crafting is something that generally, as managers, you probably do yourselves. You do a little bit of it, and maybe more senior managers do a lot of it. However, a lot of frontline staff, individual contributors, don't do it as much. Or if they do it, they probably could do it a lot more and be a lot more effective in their job, be a lot more engaged in their job. So essentially, job crafting is looking at different aspects of the job. So first of all, the research in the academic side shows that people look at job crafting by looking at the tasks themselves. So what am I doing in terms of the day-to-day jobs? They also look at relationships. Who am I interacting with in my day-to-day work? And how do I, finally, the cognitive crafting is, how do I think about my job? What's my perception of my work in the larger scheme of things? And basically what job crafting is changing aspects of either the task or the relationship or the thinking approach, or a combination of all of them. So it doesn't have to, it could be one, it could be two, or it could be all three of them. And things like task crafting, you could be having more or fewer tasks, expanding or diminishing scope of your job, or altering ways that the tasks are performed. It's not changing the deliverables that you do. So the expectation is I'm not changing my end deliverables. What you're doing is you're refining aspects of the job to do more of what really turns you on and what you like, and maybe less of what you don't like as much. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to eliminate job that no one likes to do. If people still have to do aspects of the work, but often there's things that you could tweak. I'll give you an example. We had a software, well, I was a system analyst here, and the system analyst did a lot of work on the computer side. However, he's a very social individual. So when they're working on the computers, they're very independent work. They're not interacting with a lot of people. They usually get the job. They work for it for a couple of days without a lot of interaction, maybe updating with the project manager. This is a very social individual. So what they simply did, they continued to do that work, but they actually got involved on the social committee side of the organization. So they were participating in that. That gave them a different task within their work. It expanded their scope a little bit, not of their core task, but of their interaction with the organization. Very simple example of keeping, and that person continues to be engaged. They still do their work, but they start to feed some of their demands or needs on the social side by being involved in organizing social events for the organization. The second one is relationship crafting, and that's changing the extent or nature of your interactions with others. And that's sort of identifying what people give me energy, what people that I want to work with that are fantastic to work with and are very, give me a lot of, and what people don't give me energy and maybe drain energy from me, and how do I set up my work so I can change that interaction or tweak it. I may not be able to change everything, but tweak it. And then finally, cognitive crafting is starting to think about the purpose of your task, the relationship, or the job as a whole. So what is it that I'm doing? You know, a fantastic example that's looked at in the initial academic research really looked at janitors in hospitals. And what they found, they split them into two types of people in terms of cognitive. One type of janitor saw themselves as just cleaning up dirt and doing janitorial work. The other grouping of janitors thought that their job was to help people get better. They were doing still the exact same job, you know, changing bedpans, changing sheets, mopping floors. All of them were doing the same job. However, part of that group thought about it very differently. So they cognitively crafted their job in a way that gave them more purpose, even though they were doing the same task. So I thought that those three things are interesting. We have a workbook that we do. It's called the Job Crafting Exercise. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but just to give you a sense of how these tools work in today's workplace. So we ask people to identify what they value as individuals. This could be done in 90 minutes or 2 hours. What their strengths are, you know, what they think they're really good at, and what their real passions are, what they really want to focus on. And then what they do is they start to lay out their tasks and their connections, whether they can change or any tweak or anything, the relationship or the task or the cognitive, how they think about it. And then they regroup their jobs or their work. So this, again, is not changing the tasks in terms of core deliverables, but it's crafting the tasks to meet the individual's needs in a more effective way. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to wrap up. I know only a few minutes left. So I guess I want to point out job crafting is very important. It's happening with or without your support. And by allowing employees the latitude and the mindset that it's okay to craft your job, really starts to create a different environment with your organization. So I encourage you to provide support that improves for job crafting, because it's going to improve engagement overall. So to wrap up, what I want to touch on is just sort of the last few points, and then I'll close if there's one or two questions. And again, if you can email questions in afterwards, because I'm running a little bit tight on time. We did a study, well, actually David Wexler did the studies out of Toronto, of what is it that the C-suite, CEOs, CAOs, ADMs, executive directors expect from HR. And what they found was a couple of things. They expect HR to be the stewards of champion and culture, to monitor morale, and to build, you know, people, processes, and programs to align the culture with the business goals and objectives, and to really be a trusted advisor. So that's what they said, and that's probably nothing new. But when we also asked, what more would you like to see HR do? They expected them to model the expected behavior. So, you know, if you want to have an engaged group, an engaged culture, you know, maybe the HR department or HR group should model that behavior. But I thought this was really important. Have a stronger voice. Stop acting like HR is unimportant. A lot of CEOs understand how important the people side of the equation is, and they would like to see HR step up and maybe take a stronger leadership role in pushing the mandate of HR around the people and engagement process. So I thought that was very interesting, because a lot of CEOs would like to see more leadership by HR in general. So I guess I put it back to challenge anyone on this call today is, you know, challenge yourself and your staff to start to think about their role, whether they're a leader or an individual, and to start to look into this concept of transformational leadership and how they can learn about it and teach their managers and leaders in nonprofits to be more like a successful transformational leadership. And that's the one that's most linked to engagement in the literature. So it's important to drive an engagement. And then finally, using the individual and the employee as a way to them start to take ownership. Through one-on-ones, it forces the employee to spend some time thinking about what they want, both in the front part of that 30-minute interview, 10 minutes for them, talk about their role, their job, their career, what they're working on, and then 10 minutes going forward into the future. Stay interviews, as I mentioned, stimulates the thinking of the employees and stimulates them to reimagine their role, but also gives lots of great information to managers. And then job crafting in particular helps employees and even managers reimagine their role and in a way that continues to execute on the deliverables they have to do, but in a way that is aligned with their tasks, their relationships, and their thinking that is a better individual fit for the person. So my favorite quote now, for anyone on the call to maybe use some of these tools, weekly one-on-ones, stay interviews, job crafting, and become aware of different leadership styles, and in particular transformative leadership style, and really start to be the change you wish to see. You want an engaged group, an engaged team, engaged workforce. I think it's really important to start with yourself and start to apply some tools and systems that have been proven to be linked to engagement. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, as Kelly might want to just talk about what we're doing at TalentMap coming up, as well as if there's any questions that came up throughout the thing.
Yes, thank you, Sean. So we have one great question, which is that we can cover, which is what advice can you give when handling the manager one-on-ones to make sure that you avoid micromanaging?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So it's around it's a good question around micromanaging. I think it's Terry who asked about that. Yeah, and micromanaging, it's not, when you're doing the one-on-ones, it's 10 minutes for the individual as a manager. So the first 10 minutes typically of a good effective one-on-one is where the employee talks about what they're working on, what their challenges are, what their issues are, and you're listening. You're just sitting there listening as a manager, so you're not doing any micromanaging in that sense. And the other thing is, you're only spending 10 minutes talking about what's coming up. But regardless of the discussion, what we find is employees love one-on-ones. They find them very effective, they find them very useful, and what we notice is to have them consistently. Now, sometimes they might be shorter. If everything's working really well, there's no things to communicate, there's nothing to talk about, that only might be a 10-minute. Everything's fine, here's what's on track, and so on. But it provides a great opportunity for managers in that. And all of this covered on the cheat sheet and stuff like that, so hopefully that's helpful. That will be available to you. Kelly, I think I'll turn it back over to you, and maybe I'll let you wrap up, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. So we have a number of fantastic events coming up in the new year. We're going to be doing a speaking event in the Sudbury chapter in January. We're also going to be attending HRPA chapter event, a Lunch and Learn, February 16th in Algoma as well. And then we have a couple of webinars, January 26th and February 9th. The first one's on linking wellness to employee engagement and how engagement affects customer experience in financial services. So we're covering, one specific area in financial services, but also a general one that can be used in all areas with linking wellness. And that's a very hot topic right now, so it's very timely and important. And then again, on February 21st, we're going to be participating in the conference with the Conference Board of Canada, the HR Public Sector event, Understanding, Measuring, and Improving Employee Engagement and Culture in the Public Service. And that's going to be a presentation done by Sean there on site.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Kelly, and thanks for all the participants on the call. We will talk to you and have the next webinar group in the new year. Goodbye.